Every day, you essentially pay your dues by doing the harder thing when it's the right thing to do.
Hi everyone, and welcome to GymCan's first Safe Sport webinar. My name is Ellen, and I'm the Director of Safe Sport at Gymnastics Canada. We are very grateful for your participation and interest in tonight's webinar. We are quite excited to welcome two internationally known experts in their respective fields to tonight's webinar, Dr. Gretchen Kerr and Dr. Dave Tilley. Both speakers will be sharing insights on the important topic of changing our culture, acknowledging the past, and reimagining the future. Let's get started. So to give you an idea of tonight's webinar agenda, we will begin by inviting a member of our board of directors and the chair of our Safe Sport Committee, Kim Shore, to share a welcome message. We will then hear from both Dr. Kerr and Dr. Dave Tilley. Following the presentations, Kim will then host a live Q&A period with both presenters. The evening will close out with a message from the Gymnastics Canada chair of our board of directors, Jeff Thompson. I hope you enjoy the webinar. Now please welcome Kim Shore to share a few words.
Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. Over 375 people registered to attend this webinar, which really shows the collective commitment across Canada to create safe and positive environments for everyone. In some capacity, everyone joining us tonight is a sport leader. Being a leader in sport, especially right now, requires mindfulness, a lot of courage, and the ability to see and appreciate multiple points of view at the same time. Our involvement in a youth serving organization means we have a special responsibility and obligation to help young athletes realize their greatest aspirations as people, to be healthy and happy, to belong, and to make a meaningful contribution to the world. In sport, there are many things that we have come to accept as normal or even necessary for athlete development. Yet we've learned that some of these norms have really detrimental effects on the athlete's experience. As leaders in gymnastics, a sport that demands near perfection for execution, safety, and performance reasons, it's easy to get trapped in narrow ways of thinking and doing that leave methods unchanged for decades, and in the end, don't really serve the very people we're hoping to inspire and engage. Tonight, we want to focus on positive change moving forward. We also know that acknowledging and apologizing for harmful or hurtful actions of the past is an important part of moving forward in a healthy way. Mistakes will be made, emotions will run high under pressure, hurtful things may be said, and still making amends by changing behavior is the most important thing we can do to ensure the well-being of our athletes, help our coaches find joy in their work, and continue to attract new members to our club. The GymCan Safe Sport Committee carefully selected tonight's speakers to offer you wisdom for leaders who have walked in your shoes and face the hard truths about where this sport has been and what role they want to play in determining its future. Dr. Gretchen Kerr and Dr. Dave Tilley will both offer research-based and personal testimony regarding why athletes of all ages need us to continue shifting toward a happier and healthier approach to gymnastics. Inspiring safe sport allies across the country is our #1 goal, and that takes all of us working together and supporting each other. In joining us tonight, you have demonstrated your openness to new ideas, to the perspectives and concerns of others, and a willingness to move from a place of resistance to one of expansion for the sake of all the participants in our care. We are so glad that you're here, and our hope is that you will leave the webinar with new learning, reflections, and strategies to implement and share in your own environment, and ultimately that you will feel inspired to become a champion of safe sport.
Thanks, Kim. Our first speaker is Dr. Gretchen Kerr. Gretchen is a professor in the Faculty of Kinesiology and Physical Education and Vice Dean of the School of Graduate Studies at the University of Toronto. Gretchen's research focuses on safe sport and advancing gender equity in Canadian sport. She was the senior author of Canada's first national prevalence study of maltreatment of current and former national team athletes, and a subject matter expert in the development of the Universal Code of Conduct to prevent and address maltreatment in sport, referred to as the UCCMS. Gretchen has also served as a volunteer athlete welfare officer for numerous sport organizations, including Gymnastics Canada, over the past 30 years. Most recently, she was awarded the first Canadian Research Hub on gender equity in sport. Welcome, Gretchen.
And you'll hear throughout my presentation that I'm speaking a lot about sport rather than gymnastics. Not because gymnastics isn't my home, but because the challenges we face in gymnastics are shared across other sports as well. So I'm going to position sport within broader Canadian society and its norms and expectations. And also, of course, that we need a culture shift because society is looking at us very closely, given the high profile cases that we're all familiar with. And then I'll move to what this culture shift would look like and go through a summary of mythbusters with respect to safe sport. So it's really important when we think about what's happening in sport that we look at the changes in a broader context. We have to, next slide please, consider that sport is a microcosm of the broader society. And so things that are happening in other sectors of society, whether it's in schools or workplaces, whether it's respect to gender or race or sexuality, all of those things influence what happens in sport. Next slide, please. So I'll just go through some of these broader societal influences. One is about the changing views of children and adolescents. Children and adolescents are viewed in Canadian society as being born with tremendous potential that really depends on the adults to foster. So it's up to us to nurture their talent, nurture their abilities. And we see this shift in parenting and in education to what used to be settings led by the adult in positions of power, like the parent or the teacher, shifting to a child or student-centered approach. And what this means is that the developmental needs of children and adolescents are taken into consideration. Next point, please. That there's increased attention to diversity, including diverse ways of learning. I'm sure many of you in the audience are teachers and are familiar with looking at all the different ways kids learn and trying to adapt the way we instruct accordingly. There's also been a tremendous shift from the use of punishment to disciplinary strategies, and I'll talk a little bit about that later in the presentation. Okay, next point. And these are just some examples. Spanking, of course, either with the hand or with a yardstick or a belt, was not that long ago quite common in the homes and, surprisingly, in the school system. So while I wasn't born yesterday, I'm also not. It just shows you what happens historically, because I can remember teachers hitting kids in school with the yardstick over the hand or across the bum. So that in historical perspective is not all that long ago. I also remember kids who had trouble learning or didn't do well on tests would be sent to the corner and had to wear a dunce cap, or had to, as illustrated here, write out lines on the blackboard. So there's a lot of shaming and public shaming in education. And of course, you can imagine if teachers use these strategies now, what would happen. Okay, next slide. There's no doubt that when we look at the abuse that has been recorded in sport, that it's been affected by the Me Too movement. But we should look at this as a positive effect because it's highlighted for us how power should and should not be used, that it can be used in positive or negative ways. It's also been a movement that's encouraged people to speak up about their disclosures. So part of what we're seeing in sport is a greater likelihood of people to disclose their experiences of harm, which makes you wonder how many people were silenced, 20 or 30 years ago. And it's developed a community of support for victims, which is very, very important for victims. And we've seen this online in response to Athlete A in gymnastics. We've seen it recently in Canadian artistic swimming, where there's a huge movement in online environments creating communities of support. Okay, it's also provided a lot of clarity for all of us about what's expected in terms of behavior, particularly from people in positions of authority, and it's raised the bar. So we've all been sensitized to what's appropriate and what isn't. Okay. And finally, across all sectors of society, we have increased attention on equity, diversity, and inclusion. So any safe sport movement needs to be considering all of these aspects of diversity and inclusion that in the end not only make sport experiences better, but also what makes Canadian society unique and strong. Next slide. So now let's take it to sport. Those are the broader societal influences. Now let's talk about sport. Many people view the safe sport movement as sort of a tidal wave that's come over sport. But I'd like to kind of put this in historical terms and remind everyone, if we could go to the next slide, that sport has always changed. It was only in 1967 that women were first allowed to run in the marathon. And in this picture, Catherine Switzer was actually posing as a male and then was discovered as a female and pushed out of the Boston Marathon. Historically, that's not that long ago. In the last 20 years, the physical assault that often takes place in sport, including in hockey, now has the potential to be criminally prosecuted. That's a big change. And then finally, although there are many other examples, the inclusion of para-athletes and para-athletes in all of sports is another example how sport has changed over time. So it's a natural evolution that we're looking more closely at safety and welfare within sport. So, why now? Why has the safe sport movement emerged now? Well, there's no doubt that it's been prompted by high-profile cases. And these range from abuses by coaches, sports scientists, as we have in the Nassar case, support staff, discrimination, as exemplified by Don Cherry's remarks, and we have not only sexual abuse, but psychological abuse that have been highlighted. And this movement was also prompted by the former federal minister of sport, who really emphasized that a systemic cultural shift was needed in order to provide a healthy environment for everyone. So, next slide. Okay, so what do we know about maltreatment in Canadian athletes? And I'm just going to review this very quickly because I want to shift to what we do about it. So this was a study of 1,000 national team athletes that included gymnasts, but also included athletes from 60 other sports. So I want to emphasize this is national team athletes across 60 different sports. And here are the findings, that 23% of athletes reported psychologically harmful behaviors on a repeated basis. So this is not, being something inappropriate being said to you once. This is on a repeated basis. Neglect was 1 in every 5. And sexual harm was 7%. And I'd like to emphasize these findings simply because if you followed the media alone, you would think that sexual abuse was the predominant form of abuse in sport. And while it's extremely serious and needs to be addressed, it's actually the psychological harm and neglect that is far more prevalent, and as I'll talk about later, equally as damaging to athletes. So if we can go to the next slide, here are some examples of what's meant by psychologically harmful behaviors. So they can be verbal comments, they can be physical acts, or the denial of attention and support. So the physical acts are not striking an athlete, but they're instilling fear or intimidation by physical aggression. And the denial of attention and support is when there's an intentional ignoring for poor performance, refusal to coach unless there's more effort given, for example, or being kicked out of practice. On the neglect side, these are examples. Failure to attend to injuries, failure to provide the necessities of life, food, hydration, knowing about incidences of maltreatment, particularly for minors, and failing to act, and failing to provide adequate supervision, whether it's in the gym or whether it's during travel. And these are the most common types of sexually harmful behavior. It's not the sexual assault, as serious as they are. They're the ongoing kind of, we call them microaggressions, the sexist comments and jokes, the intrusive sexual glances, these that are sort of repeated patterns of behavior that take a toll. Next slide. So, why now? Why has safe sport emerged now? Well, as I indicated earlier, social norms have changed. The ways in which we deal with one another, whether it's a teacher and a student, whether it's an employee and an employer, in our own personal relationships. What was okay in the past is not okay now. Secondly, because sport is a part of the broader society, it has to be held to the same standards. So there are practices that have been traditionally accepted in sport as just being the norm that are no longer consistent with what's acceptable in other sectors of Canadian society. And so safe sport in many ways is about bringing practices in line with these broader expectations. So it's worth, I think, taking a moment to talk about what is meant by safe sport. And interestingly, if you look at definitions internationally or even across sports, they vary. There's no one consistent definition. But this is really the ideal, and this is the one that's been adopted by Gymnastics Canada. The inclination is to think about safe sport as abuse prevention. And yes, that's absolutely part of it. It's also about the prevention of concussions and other injuries, as well as discriminatory practices. But it's far more than the prevention of harm. It's also about optimizing experiences. It's about creating a sense of joy, positive relationships. You know, we brag about sport being a wonderful vehicle to teach life skills. Well, only if it's safe sport will that happen. And it doesn't negate the importance of achievement, of doing well in sport, because an optimal experience gives the participant, gives us as coaches or leaders a sense of achievement. So it doesn't mean that we give up on performance. Next slide, please. So safe sport is for everyone. And you will see, if you've read the Universal Code of Conduct, that it applies to everyone. So that discriminatory practices between a coach and administrator falls into play here. Harassment of an official by a parent also falls into this category. So ideally, safe sport is for everyone. You'll find an emphasis in this talk on athletes. And I think that's where the safe sport movement has started, because they are the most vulnerable. So it makes sense to start with athlete protection. But the larger picture is that it is for everyone. Next slide. Okay, so in terms of a vision, what does safe sport look like? It's a culture that moves beyond simply preventing harm or preventing abuse to one that contributes to positive growth and achievement for everyone. So it clearly is beyond the scope of this presentation to talk about how we get there. But I know that there will be subsequent safe sport seminars that get into the details of creating a safe sport environment. But I'll just, on the next slide, give you a sampling of what safe sport looks like. We talk about old school methods. There's old school teaching, old school coaching. It's about replacing it with what we know about how people learn the best and how to best develop talent. There's a whole body of research. You can imagine those who are in the education field, for example, or the psychology field, know a lot about how people learn the best and how they grow as individuals and learn life skills. And so the old school methods have been replaced by things like involving athletes in decision-making in an age-appropriate way, of course, and in a safe way. And this doesn't mean, you know, would you like to condition or not? It may mean, okay, we need to do upper body conditioning today. Which of these exercises shall we do? It involves two-way communication, much less telling or directing by coaches, and a lot more asking questions. Because if athletes are asked questions, they learn more to monitor, better ways to monitor their own bodies, their own skills. They become more independent and far less dependent on coaches for performance type feedback. It also means that punishment strategies that have traditionally been used not only in sport but in school are now replaced with discipline, which is basically teaching or guiding athletes to the appropriate behavior. So exercise as punishment, for example, is a common strategy in sport, particularly in team sports, where basketball players will run suicides or hockey players will bag skate until they're exhausted. What punishment strategies do is they teach young people what not to do, but they don't teach people what to do. It also, of course, creates a lack of enjoyment of physical conditioning, which is important for sport. And it adds a negative slant to the relationship between the athlete and coach. So we'll talk a little bit more about disciplinary strategies later. Next slide. So these are the things that we want to look for, you know, in all of our clubs, regardless of whether it's grassroots level, recreational level, whether it's elite level. These are the outcomes that we want to achieve through safe sport. That the athletes have achieved athletically, whatever their goals are, that they leave sport as whole, healthy people, that they learn life skills. And later on in life, wouldn't it be wonderful if our Olympians turned around and put their own children into sport, or if they continued their engagement by being officials, judges, or going into the coaching realm or volunteering. But that maintaining involvement is certainly a sign that they've had a positive safe sport experience. Okay. Next slide. So to summarize what I hope everyone leaves with tonight, we'll go through some common assumptions about the safe sport movement and talk about how we might break some of those assumptions. So clearly there's a lot of attention on sexual abuse and sexual predators, as we know from the media reports. In fact, we learned today that a Canadian Olympic Taekwondo coach has been charged with sexual offenses of female athletes. Yes, of course, it's about this, but it's about so much more. It's about preventing other kinds of harm. As I mentioned earlier, psychological harm is the most prevalent, followed by neglect. And it's also about preventing physical harms, injuries, concussions, eating disorders, and so on. There is a sense, no doubt, across all sports that coaches are being targeted through the safe sport movement, and that so many of the cases have involved coach-athlete relationships. In part, this is because coaches and athletes, particularly at the highly competitive level, not only develop close relationships, but they should develop close relationships. And that's the dyad that spends the most amount of time together. So clearly it's been a focus of attention. But as we saw in the Nassar case, it's about anyone who has a position of power over young people. And it, again, is about moving beyond abuse prevention to how can we create these positive, healthy experiences for everyone, including coaches. Coaches have felt very sensitive about their own behaviors. There are issues around burnout, given the responsibilities coaches have. And we don't want coaches being reluctant to get into the coaching realm because they feel they'll be targeted with accusations. There's also an inclination to think that safe sport means, being soft with athletes. Sport is demanding physically and psychologically, and it's about moving athletes out of their comfort zone. It's the only way any of us grow and develop, is being pushed out of our comfort zone or encouraged out of our comfort zone. It just, that safe sport means we do it in ways that are supported by evidence. We do it in ways that keep the athlete healthy and whole and loving sport, because if they don't love sport, they will leave, and none of us want that. Okay, I've talked a little bit about this, and yes, it's important, but it's also about the whole ecosystem of sport. We can't have a safe sport environment unless we have athletes, parents, the support team, administrators, all developing a culture in which people are healthy and achieving. And if if a coach is trying to create this kind of environment and the parent is pushing for something else, then it's very difficult to make this happen. We have to help educate and infuse this kind of approach through the whole sport ecosystem. And that will take time. There are definitely policies that have arisen in response to the abuse cases, and they're necessary. Just as they emerged in workplace, around workplace harassment, for example, policies are not new in terms of this terrain, but it is about a wider philosophy. It is about the type of environment that we as leaders set in the sport context. And I touched upon this a little bit earlier. There may be a tendency to think about, well, if I focus on, health and happiness and joy, that somehow that means that we won't achieve as much athletically. And what's helpful, I think, in this respect is for all of us to think about when we perform the best. When are we the best at our jobs? When are we the best in our interpersonal relationships? When are we the best in our parenting roles? It's when we feel good about ourselves. It's when we feel supported. It's when we feel that achievement is within reach. So in fact, the argument actually works the other way. We will get the best performance from athletes and from ourselves when we have a safe sport environment. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the Q&A session.
Thank you, Gretchen. Our next speaker is Dr. Dave Tilley. Dave is a board-certified sports physical therapist, strength and conditioning coach, and gymnastics coach. He was a collegiate gymnast and has been involved in the sport for over 25 years. Along with clinical and coaching work, he is also the CEO and founder of Shift Movement Science, an educational and consulting company that many of you may be familiar with. Dave is also an active researcher within the sport of gymnastics with special interests in rehabilitation, sports performance, and workload monitoring tools. Welcome, Dave.
Here we are. All right, well, thank you so much, Gretchen, for that wonderful first presentation. And I want to say thank you to everybody here who is donating their time and their attention. I truly appreciate your efforts. And it means if you're here, you are willing to try to build a future of the sport, which we can all be proud of. And I want to kind of start this presentation just before I move on by saying that we are a living example of some of the things that Gretchen was talking about. From myself and my gym that I'm a part of, we've kind of gone through this transformation and are still actively working on things to try to really have the best experience for everyone, the coaches, the parents, the athletes, and everyone involved. So I really want to emphasize that while some of the things I will talk about that were hard for us to hear from our gymnasts, or the things that were hard to talk about with ourselves, it really comes from a place of me saying these things to everybody here as a point of empathy, and genuinely wanting everyone on this call and everyone who will be listening to this to really enjoy their experience as a coach, as a parent, as an athlete, as a medical provider. I truly think that it's really about everyone's individual happiness and trying to make sure they're excited to go to work. They love working with the kids, and they're excited to be building something for the future, that they feel confident about their skill set with what they're doing. So what I will hopefully do here is kind of illustrate where we were about 5 to 6 years ago, what our main issues were, and how we kind of navigated through those things. We've been working very hard for the last 6 or so years to do a lot of things, trial and error. And I want to share with you guys on a personal level some of the things that really made a difference for my own happiness coaching and working as a medical provider, but then also share with everyone the 5 things that we did as a gym that really made a large impact on the athletes being happy, the parents being more happy with how we were doing things, and also actually directly increasing our performance in terms of level moves ups or competitive results, or athletes reaching their goals and leaving the sport in a healthier position when they were done. So we can go to the next slide. And I think what I want to illustrate is why we changed first, right? Is what was the condition like in our gym? And you might hear some of these things resonating from Gretchen's last slides is, first of all, there was an undertone at our gym that everybody was really not happy. Everybody was pretty miserable to be there at a certain point. And especially the reason we really decided to make positive sweeping changes is because it was the middle of the season and you could just feel the air in the gym was very resentful. Everyone was very stressed out from the coaching point of view. People were arguing or bickering about things. A lot of people were really not motivated to come to work. And when they did come, it was unfortunately kind of not their best effort. The gymnasts themselves were losing motivation, not doing side drills or not wanting to condition or not feeling confident in their skills. And unfortunately, many people had injuries and were quitting or choosing to move on to other sports. And this is coming from someone who was a medical provider and was trying to actively be on top of those things. And so our culture, unfortunately, was the biggest issue that was contributing to these things, not so much any technical problem that we had on the prehab side or the medical side. So my very good friend, Eva Shute, who you will hear about in this presentation, she's our gym director, and she was battling a negative budget because many athletes were leaving and many people did not want to continue their career because they were finding that it was too hard or they were frustrated or they weren't enjoying their experience. And she was fielding quite a bit of complaints from the parents and from other people about, why are coaches upset or what's going on with my child? What's happening? Why aren't things going as we hoped? Other gyms around the area are doing well. What's going on? And then kind of linked to that, parents were, at home from an empathetic point of view, they were dealing with very frustrated kids at the dinner table, or they were dealing with kids who were really unhappy with their experience. And they were just, most of them were well-intentioned and well-hearted. They wanted to just know why and what could be done about it. So that kind of sets the framework, and we can move to the next slide. But when we really took a step back and we looked at what were the main things that were problematic for us, there were kind of three big buckets, and we'll talk about this in terms of what we did and what needed to change. But the biggest thing, and really being a little bit honest with myself when I was a younger medical provider and a younger clinician and a younger coach, is individual accountability was lacking in not in our coaching staff, but in everybody, right? In our athletes and our coaches and our parents. We all had to realize that no single person was contributing to this problem the most. It was everybody being willing to contribute to our gym's culture that was causing so much resentment and frustration. So I will wholeheartedly say that I was definitely the biggest contribution to that. I think I had a very large ego. I was very insecure about attaching my self-esteem to the results of the athletes and how many kids we had on our team doing well. And unfortunately, what that led to was me not being able to be collaborative and not being able to learn new things and say, I have to try new ideas. I have to communicate better. I took a step back and realized what I needed to change. And I think what happened is it was a ripple effect where other gymnasts saw me trying to be more humble about that, encourage them to change and so forth. So that comes to number two, which is communication and empathy. I think we really lacked the ability and the skill set to have meaningful professional disagreement sometimes between coaches, or problem solving, or be able to talk to parents kind of eye to eye about what they're feeling and what was going on, or talk to gymnasts about what their fears were or what their worries were or why they weren't, motivated or what was going on. And I think the more we communicated with ourselves in terms of introspection, and the more that we were able to have honest communication with everybody else in the gym, instead of maybe pushing things under the rug and being kind of talking behind people's back, the better we were, especially as we decided to think about what does the other person maybe think about this situation, what are alternative points of view. And then lastly, we lacked a solid structure of education. And so the biggest areas that we really lacked education were myself and a lot of other coaches who have now told this to me. We lacked technical education. So how to properly teach your Chenkos, or properly teach, double backs, or properly teach, handstands in the lower levels of recreation. We lacked, good cultural models to follow about, okay, how do we handle these problems with motivation or burnout or things of that nature? And like I alluded to, we struggled with managing conflict in a professional way, where people kind of felt they could voice their opinion and not be attacked from a gym owner point of view, or from a head coach point of view, or from a coach-athlete relationship point of view. And before we dive, we're going to dive into more of those. But before we do, I want to share something that a lot of people I've worked with have said is very beneficial to look at. And so we can move to the next slide. But this is just a model of how I think about things. And I really believe that a good culture, and I've been able to look at a lot of very high performing clubs here in the US where I live, and also across many places I'm very grateful to consult with around the world. And also I've been involved in a lot of high performing NCAA teams, and also a lot of, clubs that unfortunately maybe are struggling. And I've been able to notice some trends over the course of what we went through, but also what they have gone through. And I truly believe that first and foremost, it is important for national governing bodies and administrations to take a role in this, and also change their policies or the way they do things to help foster coaches and parents and athletes to have the tools they need. But I truly believe that everything starts with you as an individual, because organizations are made up of individual people, right? So whether it's an organization trying to change their entire ethos around culture change, it requires those individual people to start with themselves. And at a club level, the reason that we were able to make a positive change is because I was willing to do this and other people were willing to do this as well. But on a shared set of ethics and morals and values in your daily choices, you can start to kind of evolve yourself and figure out what I need to work on and how do I maybe have a better communication. And the more you do that and the better skill set you have with that, you start to be able to interact one-on-one with people at a better level. So coach athlete, coach to coach, coach to parent, parent to athlete, whatever else it is, you can build those skills to work one-on-one. You can then affect the group dynamics of maybe your small preschool class or your recreational class. You can also try to affect the more dynamics between groups, right? So maybe the one group of higher level athletes or one group of lower level athletes, maybe they are able to kind of interact better because they now have better communication skills. And as you work your way up the ladder, you can then work better on the entire gym, right? Which is kind of referred to as your tribe, so to speak. And then lastly, as you travel out to competitions or you go out in the community, you are able to better interact with different, gyms at meets or things of that nature. So when you work in a you up method, what that does is it tends to bring a lot more collective role modeling and roles to play in these problems. People are typically more empathetic. People are typically more excited to solve these problems, and it's critical thinking, and they're more open to communication. If you go the other way on the left side of the screen and you start from maybe what another group in the gym is doing wrong, or what this person is doing wrong, or not being able to see their point of view, it typically lends itself to blaming and some self-defensiveness, some resentment, and some gossip, or some kind of like talking behind people's back. And there's a very great book called Helping People Change, which identifies some of the science behind how these different forms of communication can make people more receptive to feedback, or make people more, self-defensive when they get feedback. So just wanted to share that first before we talk about what we changed. We can go to the next slide. So what exactly did we need to change? Number one, as we go back to it, was individual accountability. And there's a great quote that I heard from Tom Farden, who is the head coach of Utah Gymnastics. He said, before you point the finger, pull the thumb, right? And what that really refers to is not that you are always the person who is contributing 100% to the problem. I think in any one-on-one interaction, there is always a two-way street, and there will always be a role to play that somebody else has and you have. But I think we often are quick and sometimes reflexive to only say what somebody else had in the blame. And so as we taught people and as we tried to more with ourselves, we tried to make sure that we were a little bit more aware of other people's point of view. So when I had conversations with athletes, or when I had conversations with coaches, I would say, okay, I realize there's a problem here. And what is their role in this? What is my role in this? So, where is the communication happening dually here? And how can we both realize what we need to work on? Along with this, I think it was very hard, but I had to also say, am I basing my opinion or my interpretation of the situation on facts? Or is this something that is based on my assumption? Am I trying to guess or jump to a conclusion? I haven't actually asked this coach what they think, or this parent how they're feeling, and things of that nature. So the more that I was able to pause and reflect about what maybe is happening on their side of the fence, I was more able to see multiple points of view, and it made me a little bit less emotional with some of my decision making or some of my actual conversations. So I encourage everybody first to, like I said, not fully blame everybody, not fully blame themselves. That is not what we're trying to do here, but it's about realizing that maybe you also have a role to play. And as you approach conflict, or if you approach things that you want to change in your gym, especially with a gym owner or a head coach, when you come to them and first say, this is what I think I have to work on, and here are some possible options for change, the door is more open to have a really productive conversation, instead of maybe going and saying, this is what you did wrong, or you're not doing this correctly. I think that puts people in a little bit more of a defensive mode. So I would highly encourage people to start there. And then moving on from there, the second thing as we move the slide is we talked about communication and we talked about some empathy. We can just go to the next slide, please. And when we look at this, the quote that I really like is doing the right thing when it's the harder thing to do. And this is why the foundation of morals and ethics and values is so important. And I think that the more we were able to skillfully have hard conversations about different situations coming up in the gym, the more trust we built between our coaching staff, between our athletes, and between our parents. And so I would encourage you to reflect, maybe not now, but when you have some time, to just think about when one of these situations happens in the gym, when someone isn't doing the assignment, when somebody falls at a meet, when another coach is maybe being confrontational, if a parent emails you and says, I have a complaint, or I'd like to talk to you about something, or if a gymnast says their back maybe starts to hurt. So when those things happen, what is your go-to thought process or reaction to deal with those things? And I think the reason we talk about empathy as one of our core values is because immediately you would like to learn more about their point of view, as I said, and it puts you in a much better mindset to have a nice, professional conversation. And it leads you away from the automatic jumping to conclusion or blame or feeling as though somebody is maybe attacking you as a person. Critiquing the person's choices and maybe their actions versus them as a person is extremely important, and it's something that we learned a lot about. So I would encourage everybody to maybe try to read or try to learn about how to have a little bit better communication skills and understand multiple points of view when they're dealing with some of these conflicts. And then lastly, the biggest thing that we mentioned we needed to change was education. So we found there were 3 areas that really we struggled with. So the first of which, as I alluded to, was a technical aspect. So we didn't really have complete understanding of some of the higher level skills that the athletes wanted to learn. And then our recreational and our general non-competitive instructors didn't feel trained or properly able to manage the group dynamics of younger athletes and teach the basics of gymnastics well. They didn't get the best training, they had told us. So we wanted to learn more about that. And then from a cultural point of view, we needed to really understand the best high performing cultures. We needed to understand what makes people happy, right? We talked to other gyms. We had friends of ours. We tried to study from literature or from books or from the science of what the best performing teams do. And we shared these books amongst our coaching staff, and then would have very active discussions every few months about what we could do from those practices. And then lastly, when we were dealing with conflict, we developed something I'll talk about in the next slide called the priority filter, which is how we frame all of the decisions that we made. So we can move to the next slide now, where we'll see this priority filter. After we talk about how exactly we changed, we're going to dive into these things more and more. So I want to start, the easier thing to do is to start with the whole gym level changes and say, well, it's a problem with our systems. It's a problem with our, technical curriculum only. And what I really realized is that the biggest thing, like I talked about, is the need for me as a coach and as a medical provider to detach my self-esteem from the things that were happening in the gym, right? A gymnast performance was probably the worst offender of this. If the athletes did well at a meet, if they were learning new skills at practice, if they were performing well, all of those things, I felt as though I was doing a great job and I was a good coach and I was a good person. However, the flip side of that coin, if things did not go well, which they often do, I felt as though I was not, doing well, and I would start to get insecure and my ego would start to flare up. So also along with those things, not basing your happiness on social media or status within the community or within your gym or financial incentives or other people's approvals, when I instead was able to base those things on just my values, my morals, how I talk to people, how I talk to myself, and how I take care of myself, and my intention to do the right thing when it was the harder thing to do. I felt that was better. And what that resulted with is me being able to take more accountability for my personal life. There were many times when I would, drag my own personal life of mood into the gym, and it would rub off negatively on my coworkers or on my gymnast that I was working with, or it would just really bring the vibe of our excitement down. And so as we move to the next slide, I can tell you also that some of the things that were hardest to do was to admit that I did not know fully what I was doing. And from a technical point of view, people who helped me a lot with this, Nick Ruddick, a good friend of mine, taught me a lot about the technical skills I needed for drills or spotting or progressions. My good friend Eva taught me about beam and about, the nuances of teaching beam better. I also went to clinics and congresses. My boss Eva paid for me to invest in education, which was very helpful. Culturally, as I said, we had meetings. We listened to a lot of podcasts. We shared books. We tried to study high-performing cultures. And then lastly, on the conflict side, we developed the priority filter, but we also studied quite a bit on how to do that. And we can go to the next slide. I've been talking about this, but reframe every decision we make in these three options first, right? Of health, and then what are we going to do to make a great human? And then what are we going to do to make a great gymnast? We are always thinking about a decision only in their health first, and then we move on to what is the best for the human as a whole, and then what is best for them as a gymnast and an athlete. And I can tell you from experience, the mistake I used to make was going the other direction, where I would think about what is the best thing for their performance immediately. And then, by the way, what also is an important life lesson that we're trying to teach. And then lastly, we'll deal with an injury or health or mental health or burnout on the other side of that. And I think that was a huge error that I made and that many of us made. So I would encourage people to try to use that filter when they make decisions every day. And we can move to the next slide now. And I really think when I talk about some of the things that were most impactful for making the athletes feel that I was willing to change and that I was open to new ideas, was taking accountability for my own personal health. At that time, 5 or 6 years ago, I was just starting my company Shift, and I was working a lot. I was not sleeping enough. I was telling the athletes they should fuel themselves well and drink water and work out, but I was doing none of those things. I was not taking care of myself at all. And I also, when somebody would point out a mistake that I made, or maybe say, a certain question, do you know about this? I would oftentimes try to finagle an answer or make something up because I was insecure and I did not want to say I don't know. And so what we need to understand now is something called the say-do gap, right? You cannot have a gap between what you are doing and what you are saying, or else everybody around you picks up on that. Athletes pick up on that, and you internally have a thermometer where you know what you're saying you're doing does not align with what you are actually doing daily from your choices. And that can create a lot of resentment between you and your athletes and between other coworkers. And it also internally makes you feel very, very, unfortunately not happy, right? It makes you feel very, a little bit of an imposter with what you do. That's how I felt anyways. So we can move to the next slide now. And I think when we also talk about the conversations, those conversations kind of had three aspects to them. One was being able to be honest with myself about the things that were needed to be dealt with. Another thing was talking to other gymnasts and coaches more effectively. And then we also needed to establish better communication between our group of gymnasts that we were coaching to encourage them to be a part of the decision-making and be a part of the creation of our cultural guidelines, which Gretchen talked about in a two-way communication. And I think this slide on the right really resonates with a lot of people because you can replace the boss with head coach, recreational coach, parent, captain of a team, whatever else it should be. And we now try to share this graphic with our coaches who are new on boards to say, your goal is to lead them, not stand behind them and tell them what to do. And we can move to the next slide now. And when we talk about what did we do on a global level, once all of the coaches had made better impact on the individual level, and these are more of the tactical things in terms of coaching specifically. Number one is we instated a radical communication policy where we told the athletes, we told the coaches, the parents that they are able to tell us anything as long as it's respectful and it is honest. And I got that from Valerie Kondo's field when I was working with her a little bit. And so what that did is it allowed us to hear honest feedback that maybe we were too afraid or nervous to hear previously. And we will try to now hear what you are saying, and we promise to not be upset when you do that. So we tried to make it an open forum, whether they wanted to do that in a group setting or on a one-on-one parent meeting or on a one-on-one specific meeting with an athlete. And a very big point in our change came 4 years ago when the athletes of the group that I was coaching wrote a very long yet respectful letter about the things that they noticed that we were maybe doing as coaches, such as bringing our mood into the gym with us and being maybe projecting our own bad moods on them, or maybe picking favorites and working with a certain athlete and not another one. And we weren't aware of these things, but we worked on them. And then we also said, okay, we hear you. Here are some things that frustrate us when you guys talk instead of doing all the side drills. when you guys don't focus during conditioning and then you get upset when you can't get new skills. These are things that we notice that frustrate us. How can we work on these things together? And it was really, really helpful. I think, within a week of that letter conversation, our culture completely changed. And we'll talk about also, if we click the next bullet point, is our family guidelines. We would make these every year as a team about what mattered to us. And one was that everybody was involved in this process, so they felt that they kind of had a role to play. But also, it was a really good way to hold each other accountable when somebody maybe was having a moment of frustration or somebody was not doing something that we feel is in line with our morals. We could politely say, hey, we're making this decision for you not to vault in this meet because we care about your health and we need more work on your drills or on your strength or whatever else it is. And if you look at number one, we agreed on that. We agreed on that your health always comes first, and we talked to parents about that. And usually when we diffuse that conversation with these guidelines that we all agree upon, it's a much smoother conversation. It's not so standoffish. So those were two things that were very helpful. Another thing, as we move to the next slide, that was extremely helpful for us was having a stoplight system for how we move up in levels. A lot of our animosity and parent complaints came from move-ups. Why did my athlete not move up? Or what is she not doing well to get to this skill or this level? And this happened in the recreational side, from moving up in classes, kind of our tiny tumblers to our, middle level to whatever else we had named at that time. Parents were frustrated. They didn't know how to move up. And then athletes were frustrated at the end of the year when they did not move up. And so what we did is create a system based on our core values, how well these core values are represented, based on attendance, based on strength completion. So are you attending all of our strength sessions? What are your skill progressions like? What are your average meet scores? Are you balancing your time with school? Do you have a lot of stress going on? Do you want to do other activities? These are all factored into our red, yellow, and green lights. And a green light obviously being that things are going well for your skills here, or you're consistently doing your strength and coming to practice, or you're showing our core values well. A yellow would be something that is on the progress route but needs, some more work. And obviously a red would be something that is not quite there yet. And so we would tell the athletes twice per year where they stand. And for someone to kind of move up, we would need mostly greens with a few yellows. Everybody has some areas they need to continue to work on, ourselves included. So that was extremely helpful to outline those for every competitive level and every class that we have within our system. So there was no confusion and parents didn't feel blindsided. They felt they had no idea this was coming, and then they had to deal with a very upset gymnast at the end of the year. So I would highly encourage people to do that as well. And then moving on to the next kind of tactical on the competitive side, another point of inflection that often was problematic was when we got to a meet or the week of a meet and somebody was not safe or ready to compete a skill they had been working on. And they got very upset with us about not being able to do that. And then oftentimes I will admit fully that I let kids compete skills that were almost there, but not completely. And unfortunately, it led to a lot of mental blocks or somebody having an accidental slip and they got hurt. And the issue was that we did not clearly make any definitive, you can compete this skill or not, well ahead of time. So what we did is we made a rule of 7. And this is just that before every meet, not just the season, the athlete would need to show us specifically in a competition or a mock competition setting that they are fully able to safely do those skills 7 times each day, not each day, but consecutively within a few days leading up to the meet. And so that really helped us have a much better line in the sand for who is going to compete, who is not. And the next bullet point will show we would have some modification. We would maybe water down a set. We would maybe scratch 1 event, but let them compete 3, even if that affected an all-around score, obviously. But when those things were clearly discussed and they were put in our handbook, there were no awkward tension moments at meets when somebody was scratching and a parent did not know why. And we can move on to the last point here, which I think was the most important for our culture, was the girls that we coach and many of the other people in our gym would complain and say, all we focus on is gymnastics. It's never about fun. It's never about meeting my teammates and hanging out with my teammates outside of just the actual competitive environment or out of the training environment. So what we did is we tried to organize more non-gymnastics community events so that we can encourage people to, come and be a part of it and not worry about gymnastics. So this was 2 years ago at our Halloween party. You can see or maybe our Christmas party. You can see some wonderful holiday, costumes in those. So we did some movie nights where we would have a projector and we would do some, everybody bring a snack and we would watch a movie. We did a lot of community outreach. We would have a holiday gift giving to the community where we would have their parents maybe donate $20 and we would go to a wall and try to buy gifts for people who are less fortunate. We would all go to the mall together and we would buy those things and then we would leave them kind of as a community drop off, which was very, very fun. But also with that, as you see here, we did holiday parties. As the next bullet will show, we did a Halloween party, we did a summer kickoff party, and we also did staff outings, right? So we would have times when we would, buy dinner for the staff, and we would invite them out to hang out with us and have everybody from the recreational side also hang out with the competitive side, who also hangs out with the front office staff, the people they don't normally get to really spend time with. And that fostered a lot of really great culture of people helping each other and knowing more than just who they are at work, but actually knowing them as a person. And the next slide, I think, is where we'll talk about the parties. The most favorite is the summer barbecue that we have every year before we kick off our next year. So hopefully that was helpful. I apologize if I was talking a little fast. I get excited sometimes. But those are some practical things that really we found made a big difference in our gym.
Great. Thanks so much, Dave. That was fantastic. I have some questions now from the audience that maybe I could start with you, Gretchen, if you're available.
Okay.
So we have a comment from one of our community members, and I'll read it out. The most important thing I want the gymnastics community to know is that the mental and emotional harm in the gym does not heal or disappear when the maltreatment ends, even if the athlete leaves the gym or the sport. The damage is deep, sometimes irreversible, and touches every aspect of the person's life. Maltreatment destroys this person's self-confidence, self-perception, and sense of worth. It affects how they progress in the sport or fail to, how they interact with others in daily life, and how they assess their worth in the world. And it's preventable. All of the fallout, all of the damage is preventable. So that's a pretty intense statement. And I think it probably hits us all in a really profound way. I'm wondering, Gretchen, could you speak to what the research tells us about the short and long-term effects of maltreatment, and maybe specifically its impact on performance and the implications for life after gymnastics?
Right. Really important question. And there is research that answers this question. I think a lot of us have come to appreciate the long-term struggles that any victim of sexual abuse may encounter. What's less known is the long-term, short and long-term effects of psychological abuse and neglect. And in athletes, this plays out in having low self-esteem. It plays out in becoming more anxious and depressed. For female gymnasts and other female athletes in athletic sports, much of the abuse takes place through body shaming, weigh-ins, comments about bodies and fat and taking food off plates and that sort of thing, is obviously related to eating disorders and body image problems, not only in sport, but long after they retire from sport. Trouble with trust in relationships. So there's been some interesting studies that have followed high performance athletes and who have experienced abuse in sport and then end up in abusive interpersonal relationships. And this is all in addition to, of course, it takes away from the enjoyment of the sport. We've got emerging research, not in gymnastics yet, but in hockey, that shows that the dropout rates that we see are highly related to experiences of abuse. So all of these things are to play out. And I think what's really important is that it is this kind of accumulation of the day-to-day microaggressions that can have a really lasting impact on the health and development of young people.
Great, thanks. Over to you, Dave. How do you incorporate the athlete's voice into your coaching philosophy and everyday practice?
Yes, this is a great question, and I'm happy that they asked this, because it's a tough line between being the person who needs to make a plan and needs to really stick to a set, regiment to get ready for anything, a recreational show or a competitive event. And I think what we try to do is really explain a lot why we're doing things and what the rationale is behind why we're asking athletes to do certain things. And so when I ask athletes, I would like you to do a 15-minute warm-up with these basics, and then 5 of your first skill, and then a watered-down set, and they are upset with me, I try to really explain the purpose behind that. And then I ask them, do you feel that's too much, unreasonable? Do you feel that's, something that you can handle in a 45-minute rotation? And there oftentimes people are saying, they'll say back to us like, no, I think that's doable. It's just hard. And I say, okay, well, if it's challenging, let's try our best for the first half hour. If you find it's too much, let's do 3 quality turns, and then we'll work on something else. And then one person inevitably from that group of 8 girls that I work with will say, well, my wrists are really sore, or my back is a little sore, or I'm really tired today. I had a long day at school and I'm exhausted. And I say, I totally understand that. How about we today modify your assignment, and then maybe when we come to bars on Wednesday, maybe you can do those skills then. Would that be okay? And they say, yeah, I'd love that. I'll get a great night's sleep. My test will be over and we'll go on. Usually that works 90% of the time. If we have a situation where an athlete is chronically trying to not do the intended work that we know is important for them, we have a different conversation about goals, and is there something else going on you're not telling us? And oftentimes that will lead to a much more explorative conversation. And they say, well, actually, I feel really nervous for this meet. I don't think these skills are things I can do well. I'm really stage fright with bars, or I'm having a fight with my boyfriend. There's all sorts of other things that come up from that conversation. And we have a different conversation about non-gymnastics things and make sure that's not part of it. And then we say, okay, if it's a gymnastics thing, let's talk about a strategic plan. Do I need to learn something to help you better? Or is there another way we can structure this event, this plan for you leading up to the meet? Sometimes it's that conversation that allows the things to feel better because they're heard. And sometimes it really is an issue of, I don't feel ready to flip my vault. Say, okay, we'll do a different vault for this meet, and then we'll attack this on Monday with a different plan. So hopefully that explains a little bit of the process there.
Great. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Over to you, Gretchen. When does behavior cross the line into maltreatment? And for example, this coach is asking, I'm not trying to be hurtful, but sometimes I give challenging conditioning as a consequence because my group isn't listening or an athlete cheats on an assignment. Sometimes kids cry, or I hear later from parents who aren't happy about the conditioning.
Okay, I think that's a really relevant question, and one that a lot of sport leaders are wrestling with. And I think this is a function of the fact that in schools, punishment is now replaced with discipline. And we haven't quite made the shift in sport. So, if kids aren't paying attention, for example, and they're given conditioning exercises, those two things are not necessarily related. In other words, what is it about conditioning that tells the kid how to pay attention or why they should pay attention? Those two things are disconnected. And the conditioning then becomes associated with something negative rather than something positive. And instead, the strategy around discipline is tell the kids what's expected in terms of behavior. So I need you to listen to the instructions, not only so that you can learn, but so that we have a safe environment. Because if you're not listening, in gymnastics, we need to be safe. So you identify the appropriate behavior, you tell them why it's important, and then you reinforce it. So rather than punishing the kid who's not paying attention, discipline is about reinforcing and praising the kid who is paying attention. And there's a reason why this works, and that's that we all respond better to praise and encouragement than we do to punishment and criticism. And so that's a shift that is time consuming, but it also is very constructive. It maintains the relationship between the coach and athlete intact. It keeps the practice positive. It keeps the frustration level lower for the coach. There's all kinds of benefits.
Okay. And related to that, I'll ask you just another one because it's very similar. What is the definition of abuse? Is it abuse? Is abuse a forced or unwanted number of repetitions?
Yes. So, coaching is about encouraging kids out of their comfort zone. So it's going to be, doing more reps than perhaps the athlete would like to do. So that kind of encouragement, no, it wouldn't be abuse. But we've all seen those kids who are, they can't do a skill on the balance beam, and they might be frightened, and they're standing there crying, and they're being told they have to keep doing it. That runs into a dangerous territory because the potential for harm is great. If you can argue that the athlete is not physically prepared or psychologically prepared to perform a skill, then that runs the risk of creating harm and abuse. So it's not about, and this is what I meant by, it doesn't mean that coaches need to be soft. They can still be firm, they can be demanding, but to do it in a way that maintains doesn't put the athlete's health at risk. That's really what it's about, physically and psychologically.
Okay, thanks. Dave, a question for you. What is some advice you have for green coaches? I guess that means new coaches new to their profession who have old school supervisors.
Yes, this is, I could probably say I get this question at least 4 times a month. So I understand that many people are trying to change maybe their approach, especially if they have, listened to some webinars or they've listened to a podcast and they're trying to do that in their gym. But they often work with someone many generations older than them who maybe is not open to the same changes. And oftentimes they are nervous about their financial and career security in that gym. And so the first thing that I have learned is to always, hopefully as the presentation resonated with, is to approach the situation with one of empathy and one of constructive solution, right? I think a younger error that I made was approaching all of these situations with what that person was doing wrong. Like you didn't know that, this should change, or that's not what we do anymore. And it immediately put somebody in a defensive state. So I try to encourage people to say, what are they thinking? And say, listen, I know you have maybe done this for a long time. I respect you as a coach. You are someone who I learned technical knowledge from. And I understand that maybe this is something you're not familiar with. However, there's a lot of research coming out saying there's a different way to do flexibility that is maybe more beneficial and limits some of the harms. And I actually went out of my way and I studied this a lot. Here are 5 things that we might be able to do to enhance the athlete's performance instead of what we are doing now. Can we maybe try this for 2 weeks and see if it works? And if you don't agree with it, we'll try to figure out something else. And usually that is a little bit less of a powder keg approach to the situation. And the next follow-up question is, I immediately get shot down. They don't want to do anything. What do I do? Well, at that point, you have to then move on to maybe the head coach or maybe the gym owner and voice a similar conversation about, hey, I think we should change these things for the athlete's health. I want everyone to be performing well. Here are the things I think we should change. Can we try them? And maybe that will work. If the gym owner is also the person who you are having conflict with, there is a hard decision about, can I talk to somebody else, and maybe the group of coaches can maybe approach in a more of a group mentality and say, we all believe this is possible to change. If you go through 3 layers of that kind of hierarchy and you still get to the end of the road, you have to ask yourself, is this a good fit for me? Is this gym morally and ethically a good fit for me, where it's not even about possibly doing something that is no longer supported by science. It's about a lack of growth mindset, a lack of collaboration, a lack of feeling that your voice is heard, a lack of shared purpose and mission. There will be many more frustrating points down the road if this small thing about flexibility or a conversation or an injury can't be dealt with in an appropriate and safe way. And I have left gyms that unfortunately I didn't agree with morally. And I have also had other people do that. And sometimes it requires sacrifice. It does. And it's really challenging because your livelihood is there. But your mental health and your emotional health is not worth it as a coach if someone really refuses to even listen to a possible alternative solution.
Okay, awesome. Okay, just so you know, we have a ton of questions coming in, so we will be here till midnight.
Yes.
Over to you, Gretchen. I think this question relates to you in your role as our volunteer athlete welfare officers. Members of the coaching community have expressed that safe sport sometimes feels like a witch hunt. Could you speak to the process of vetting and evaluating complaints while still ensuring that the process is fair to everyone?
Yes, very important question. And let me begin by saying that this is not a process that Gymnastics Canada developed. It is a process called due process and natural justice that are principles that guide any kind of complaint mechanism, whether it's in the workplace, whether it's in sport, whether it's in the legal system, etc. And what that means is, and it always follows the same process, a complaint comes in, the athlete welfare officer interviews the complainant, person making the complaint, and any witnesses that may have information to help understand what occurred. And then the person, the respondent, the person who is the complaint is about, also is interviewed. And at that point, there are a number of decisions. Either there can be a determination that there's nothing going on here, that it's unwarranted, unjustified, unsupported, or it can be that, yes, there is something here, there's something wrong going on, but parties are willing to work it out through informal mediation or education. And then the third option is that it goes to a formal investigation and potentially a hearing. But what's important to remember in a sport like gymnastics is very often we're dealing with minors. And the Canadian law stipulates that any adult who either knows or suspects that a child is at risk of harm must report. And it doesn't mean that if you make a report and it turns out to be unfounded, there's no penalty for you. But the emphasis in the law is on prevention. And that explains why sometimes coaches are suspended during the investigation. Because if there is any risk of other young people being at risk of harm, then it's the responsibility of the organization, the club, Gymnastics Canada, the provincial organization, etc., to temporarily remove the coach from that setting until the investigation is done. The same thing happens in schools and other areas that involve young people. And that is because we're obligated to respond to any suspicion or any likelihood that a child is at risk. Both parties are entitled to due process, which means right to confidentiality, right to knowing all of the information and the evidence against the person. And so those principles apply throughout the process. There's much more that goes on behind the scenes in the background than what might be visible to the community. And I think that's why it's difficult to understand some of these decisions. But those are the principles that guide the process.
Right. And not all interested parties are privy to all of the information or even the outcomes sometimes. Is that correct?
That's correct. Just the, in fact, not even the witnesses sometimes, just the complainant and the respondent are entitled to the outcome. That's correct.
Great, thanks. Dave, here's a question for you. Can you comment further on how you guide the conversation around the family rules that you mentioned earlier with your athletes? How much of it are things that you lead them to, and how much did they actually come up with themselves?
Yes, fantastic question. And I will preface this by saying I work with 14 to 18-year-old and college level athletes. I do not work with the 5, 6, 7-year-old preteens. That is a very different conversation. We don't actually have set, writing on the wall and stuff. We just try to teach them about what does it mean to be a good teammate. We try to praise, as Gretchen said, the positive human level behaviors like, wow, that was so nice that you let her go ahead of you in line, or you let her do this. We try to build the same inherent family guidelines and culture. And we also believe wholeheartedly with both groups in role modeling. I think that is the best thing that we try to do positively. So some of these things do come up organically, just because they're things that we all really have talked about or we believe in. We share a lot of books and quotes in our WhatsApp. We have a WhatsApp, group chat for the silly things with parents. Parents ask about leotards. So we have one for the gymnasts as well, for the coaches to say, remember your grips, or something of that nature that's not related to our personal life. But in those, people share quotes, people share books, people share stuff like that. So some of these come from a great podcast that somebody found, or some of them are prompted by myself and things that I believe are important for the whole group to follow. One of which is a perfect example is the ego is the enemy, or the priority filter. Those are things that I kind of believe in and lead my own life with, and we try to translate that to the athletes. But the majority of all of those are, we started with 50 ideas. Some were unbelievably hilarious that weren't really appropriate guidelines. And some were actually really well thought out things that came from that letter, for example, that hard conversation we had. One of the ones on the family guidelines was 3 personal days per season with no questions asked. The athletes said that there are some days when I have no other reason that I don't want to come to practice, but I just am absolutely drained, but I'm scared to tell you because you're going to think that I'm slacking or something. And we wanted to say we believe wholeheartedly in your mental health. So if you are that overwhelmed that you need a day, practice will probably not be that productive anyways. So take your day, do your schoolwork, sleep, do whatever you need to do, and you just text the group chat and say, hey, won't be there, personal day. Sounds good. So some of them are the athletes coming to us. Some of us are from outside resources that we've studied, podcasts. Some are other coaches' suggestions. But I work with 3 other amazing coaches, and then there's 15 people in our group of the level that I work with. So a lot of ideas kind of bouncing back and forth. And then we have 20 to 25, and then we refine them again a couple days later. And then the ones that are really the ones we believe in for that season, we change them each season, are the pretty handwriting. That is not my handwriting. That is not a skill set that I'm good at, but somebody else writes those up.
Great, thanks. Okay, maybe we have time for maybe one more question each, although there's lots. So our apologies to the community, but we will endeavor to do a written version of the Q&A and have some of your questions answered.
I'll definitely answer all of them that I have.
Okay, so Gretchen, related to reporting of maltreatment, a comment from the community: a lot of the children in sport lack the cognitive level to identify abusive behavior by those in power. How can we avoid putting the onus on the child to report abuse when many are not listened to when they try? Therefore, abuse is underreported. Can you comment on that? Yes,
happy to. First and foremost, the responsibility should not be on the kids to identify abuse. It's not their responsibility, and it's If we did that, it would be a little bit like victim blaming. The onus, the responsibility is entirely on the adults in positions of power and authority to not only understand what maltreatment behaviors are, but to know how to identify them, prevent using them themselves, and also intervene when they see them occurring elsewhere. There are, however, supports that clubs can consider implementing to help athletes talk about experiences that are upsetting or unsettling. And that is often to have an athlete advocate within a club. This can be, for example, a retired athlete who understands the experience, who can meet with the athletes on a regular basis, and they just chat about how things are going, develop that rapport. And then if an athlete does have something comes up, they have a question or concern about, they know someone who's friendly, who can be neutral, who can be removed from their coach or their parent to talk to. So that's often a helpful strategy in the club environment.
Great, thank you. Okay, over to you, Dave. How can I still be successful as a coach according to the standards at my club or with parents if my athletes aren't working as hard because I'm not challenging them as much?
That is a fantastic question. There are two layers to this that I think are very important. One is the alignment of goals and clearly stating what those goals are to make sure that the parent, the athlete, the coach, the medical provider, everyone is on the same pathway, that is the intended goal. Goals change often. And another thing that we did that was very helpful is we started having an end of the year meeting with every single athlete in our club group, and also with the group as a whole to say what went well, what didn't go well, what can we change. Same thing with the athlete one-on-one. How are you as a human? How's school? Do you enjoy this still? Have your goals changed? And sometimes they say, no, I'm doing great. I enjoy it. This is challenging training, but it's fun. And then the other times they say, well, actually, I don't really want to do this level anymore. I'd rather do a different, we have high school gymnastics, which is a different avenue for them. I'd rather just do high school gymnastics and not worry about the competitive element here. And we say that's great as long as we know. So that way, as coaches, we don't have unrealistic expectations of what we would like them to do to be safe in the sport, right? And everybody here knows the higher level or more intense the gymnastics comes with more time, more energy, more focus, more strength and conditioning, more outside of the gym attendance or maintenance of your recovery and sleeping well and managing your time. And so if the goals are shifting and we haven't had that conversation and the parent maybe doesn't know that, we try to relay that so the expectations are met. If the goals are clearly aligned, but still we feel as though somebody maybe is not doing the things needed, we talk about the difference between the expectation of what their goal takes versus the reality of what their goal takes. And so sometimes that is a conversation about, well, I would love for you to do college gymnastics too, but there are many things that go into being able to successfully get to a competitive college level. Here are the things on the technical side. Let's break down each of your event. Where can we work on things here? Is there a plan? Let's talk about your time management skills. Let's talk about your mental health and your sports performance. Is there somebody we can work with for that? We try to identify why those things aren't going well. But if the athlete has the goal and they are open and understanding of what it takes to get to that goal, oftentimes they are able to put in the work needed if they care about it a lot. And I think I want to really encourage that we do train hard, but very intelligently. We are soundly based in a lot of science, but we believe in very intelligent, hard training is the best way to keep athletes safe. And I do strength with my athletes once per week, and I test the workouts before I give them to them, so they don't think that I'm not understanding of what's going on. It's again that say-do gap, right? It's easy for me to sit on the sidelines and say, do more rope climbs. It's hard for me to do 5 rope climbs. So we try our best as a coaching staff to lead by example, but we also try to really clearly state what are the goals, what is the roadmap to those goals, and if we don't have the right pieces? How can we help you get the things you need to be successful? Or what do I need to learn to help you be successful? Or who can we, outsource something to? I've talked with Nick many times about technical issues that I can't quite figure out, or we've hired nutritionists to come and talk about fueling themselves well, or we've talked to mental health performance coaches to come in and talk about fears and anxiety. So we try to give them what they need, but have a pretty honest conversation about, is this a goal problem, or is this a pathway to the goal problem, or is this just a distortion of the work needed versus what, what's going on with a priority?
Great. Well, I think that it's getting late here, so I think we will again capture all those questions that the audience has sent in. We'll have them routed to the appropriate expert here. Thank you both so much for clarifying and elaborating on your previous points. So many valuable things. I want to turn it over now to Jeff Jeff Thompson, who is a relatively new to the board of directors, but not at all new to Gymnastics in Canada. Jeff is the chair of the board, and he's going to say some closing remarks. And then hopefully after Jeff is done, maybe Ellen will be able to join back on. We've had some technical audio issues there. So Jeff, if you want to go ahead and give us some of your thoughts to close us off.
Well, thank you very much, Kim. It looks like I'm sitting here in some quite nice mood lighting, doesn't it? Anyway, first, I really want to thank Dave and Dr. Kerr for coming on and for sharing their expertise with us. I mean, the reality is that in the whole world right now, probably the biggest single issue that's going on is the issue of safe sport. We have COVID and we have all that, but honestly, internally, safe sport is the number one issue. And I think we're very, very fortunate that at Gymnastics Canada, that we have Ellen and we have Kim and her team of volunteers on the safe sport stuff. I have worked in sport for an awfully long time, over 40 years, and familiar with a lot of other sports and the processes and policies that they have in place. And I'm really convinced we have one of the best. It's extremely robust, it's objective, it's fair. And I know sometimes people feel threatened by it a little bit. I understand that. I've gotten back into coaching sport climbing now after many years of coaching gymnastics. And I had to go through a deep soul search of myself and how I was as a coach when I was in the gym. And there's no doubt that when I reflected back, that the methodologies I was using, some of the things that I was saying, some of the things that I were doing would absolutely not be appropriate in today's world. And it's about saying, I can forgive myself for that, and I'm willing to move on from it. And I think Dave said a number of things that really resonated with me. It sounds like you and I, Dave, went through this kind of similar epiphany or similar revelation where it's like, I want this to be something deeply meaningful for the people I work with. That I'm making better human beings. And I was able to forgive myself, and now I'm trying to do the best job I can to coach in a very humane way. And I think, like you also said, look at yourself, take your responsibilities, adjust accordingly, and then move forward. And it's the coaching I'm doing now compared to what I was doing before is immensely more rewarding. I'm so much happier as a coach, and our athletes are doing exceptional. We have, half the national champions in climbing are coming from our gym. Whereas before, I'd never had that kind of success in gymnastics. So they're happy kids, they're doing super well, and I can live with myself. And I think it's just being honest with yourself and say, this is the kind of person, I want to be remembered as, and not being afraid to change. But yeah, thanks, Ellen and Kim, for setting this up. I hope we can do more of this sort of stuff. I know the board is behind it 100%. And our CEO, Ian, is really appreciative of all the work that you do in pushing this critical agenda forward. So thank you very much.
Once again, we thank you for joining us this evening. To our attendees, we look forward to future learning experiences together. In the meantime, please visit our website to learn more about the GymCan Safe Sport program, including access to policies and educational resources that help advance safe sport in your communities. Thank you.